also include a territory that we have not talked about yet, and it's going to be where we kind of focus more of what we have to say this morning on, and we'll get that in a moment. Again, I've got this entitled "The Entire Israel," because again, there's a lot of geography that is encompassed in these verses, and so again, most of the time we're going to focus on verses 1 through 6, verses 7 through 24. A lot of that is what was covered last chapter. It's just kind of another summation of it. But as we're going to see, the importance of what this chapter does is it will help us explain the dimensions of Israel in light of the chapters that are to follow. Because in Numbers 13 or Joshua 13, there's still some places that have not been conquered that will again kind of be defined for us. But then the chapters that follow, when it talks about the division of the tribes and which tribe gets what piece of land and what cities and things like that, the way that we understand that is in essence based on the geography that's mentioned in chapter 12, chapters 11 and 12. So this is we're calling this the entire Israel. And there are two things that we kind of want to think about as we look at this chapter this morning. The first point of application, or the first key thing to keep in mind, is that there are no obstacles that are too big for God. I know sometimes we deal with obstacles, whether that is other people, whether that is health-related issues, whether that is temptation. You know, we deal with all sorts of we deal with all sorts of problems, and sometimes we feel like those problems are pretty big to deal with, and sometimes they are. But the point is that there's no obstacle that is really too big for God. Again, I'm reminded of a passage that connects with that, and that's 2 Kings 3 and verse 18, where that passage goes back to a time later on in Israel's history, where you read about the Moabites and their rebellion against Israel, and Elisha delivered a statement to the king of Israel, and he said, "This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand." And that was in response to the king of Israel thinking that the Moabites were a very big obstacle for him to overcome. But Elisha's point was that with the help of God, that would be a very light thing. And so we'll apply that in a minute to what we say about Sihon and Og, which will come out in the first 6 verses. And then the other thing we want to kind of keep in mind is that sometimes the efforts that we make for God in our earthly lives, sometimes those don't go completely recognized while we are on the earth. And I have up there Acts chapter 2, because in my mind, I think about the fact that, you know, Christ, while he was on the earth, talked about the coming of the kingdom and how there were a lot of people who obviously misunderstood what Christ meant. We're not fully aware. And then you get to Acts chapter 2 with the work of the Holy Spirit and the apostles preaching the gospel. A lot of people at that point finally became aware and finally learned exactly what Christ was meaning while he was on the earth, talking about the coming of the kingdom of God. And again, Christ's earthly work in some ways was not fully recognized, at least until the creation of the church in Acts chapter 2. And so sometimes our efforts as Christians, as people of God, we try to do a lot for the Lord. We feel like maybe it doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. But sometimes the efforts that we make do pay off, even if that is after we leave the earth. We'll point that out as well in connection with the first 6 verses and how it fits with verses 7 through 24. So we begin with our first section, and again, this is what we're going to focus on most of the time, and that is verses 1 through 6, which talk about the area east of the Jordan River. And I'm not going to make Dad read this because there are a lot of names that are involved in this, so I will read this myself. But what this section we're about to read is describing everything that is to the east of the Jordan River. So again, the Jordan River right there. Everything to the east of that is the territory that's being described in these 6 verses. And we'll look at a couple of other different maps that help put some of these people in the locations where they're mentioned in a moment. But Joshua 12, verses 1 through 6. These are the kings of the land whom the children of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed on the other side of the Jordan, toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon to Mount Hermon, and all the eastern Jordan plain. One king was Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and ruled half of Gilead from Aroer, which is on the bank of the river Arnon, and ruled half of Gilead from the middle of that river, even as far as the river Jabbok, which is the border of the Ammonites, and the eastern Jordan plain from the Sea of Chinneroth, or the Sea of Galilee, as far as the Sea of Arabah, the Salt Sea, the roads of Beth Jeshemoth, and southward below the slopes of Pisgah. The other king was Og, king of Bashan, and his territory, who was of the remnants of the giants, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and reigned over Mount Hermon, over Salcah, over all Bashan, as far as the border of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and over half of Gilead, to the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. These Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel had conquered, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given it as a possession to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh. So again, when we read that, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, doesn't register a whole lot in our brains, but everything that's talked about there is talking about the territory east of the Jordan River. Again, Reuben, Gad, and then the half the tribe of Manasseh. Up to this point in the book of Joshua, we haven't really talked about this part of Israel yet. We talked about the conquest of southern Canaan, talked about the conquest of northern Canaan, but now the writer is tying all of this in together, at least all of the dimensions of the 12 tribes of Israel, by now including this the area where these 2.5 tribes occupy. And the reason why we have not talked about this up to this point is because the writer is recalling past events in Israel's history. As it indicates to us in verse 6, the events of verses 1 through 5 and that part of the conquest occurred under who? Moses, right? What's described in verses 1 through 5, that part of the conquest occurred under the leadership of Moses. And sometimes we think about the conquest of Canaan, we think about the book of Joshua, we think about the efforts of Joshua as a leader. The point is that Moses, even while he was on the earth, had a hand in part of the conquest, even if he was not allowed to go into Canaan. Again, the reason why these 2.5 tribes exist is because of the efforts of Moses and the people of Israel underneath his command. As we'll talk about the details more of that in a minute. And so, by incorporating verses 1 through 6, we now have a full picture of essentially what Israel looked like by the time that the conquest was over. Again, if we only had Joshua chapter 11, we wouldn't realize that the Israelites also occupied part of the land east of the Jordan River. That, of course, being necessary for how big Israel's population was. So we've got a full picture of what Israel looks like. And again, it reminds us of the fact that some Israelites desired to put the will of God far above their own desires. Again, when we go back to Joshua chapter 1, there was a potential dilemma when it came to the conquest of Canaan, because what could have been the key issue in Joshua chapter 1 with the conquest of Canaan? As it related to the eastern tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. Right. Remember that in Joshua chapter 1, that there were a group of Israelites who Joshua, and he's told this by the Lord, Joshua told those Israelites, even though you have your land, you're still expected to go west of the Jordan River and help fight. And we know that they actually did that, right? You go back and look through Joshua chapter 1, we know exactly that those people, and again, specifically, the eastern tribe of Manasseh, Gad and Reuben, those individuals did make that sacrifice and went west of the Jordan River and helped the Israelites fight, the men of war at least. And so the verses 1 through 6 also again remind us of these are individuals who already had their land, had it during the time of Moses, but they were also willing at the same time to sacrifice their own personal desires, tending to their own land, taking care of their families, things like that. They sacrificed that desire to do God's will, to then go west of the Jordan River and fight. And so that's why verses 1 through 6 are important. Again, those boundaries being defined, but also reminding us of the fact that these are people who already had their land and yet sacrificed it to help out the entirety of Israel as a whole. All right? So here we have described to us the valley of Arnon, or as you notice here, verse 1, it says, from the river Arnon to Mount Hermon. And again, in verse 1, it says that this is the land possessed on the other side of the Jordan River toward the rising of the sun, which again is a reference to the eastern portion of the Jordan River. So the dimensions that are given here from the river Arnon to Mount Hermon, those two dimensions define the southern and northernmost boundaries of Israel east of the Jordan River. The Arnon Valley came, or at least the Arnon Valley was defined by the Arnon River, which is just kind of halfway lengthwise to where the Dead Sea is. And so the Arnon Valley would have represented the southernmost territory that Reuben, that tribe, occupied. Again, Mount Hermon, we've talked about, marked the northernmost boundary of Israel. That marked the northernmost boundary specifically of the eastern tribe of Manasseh. And so that's what that indication is telling us, is the north and south dimensions of what Israel possessed east of the Jordan River. And again, that's why that's important. I've got up here a few different passages. We're not going to look at all of these. But when we go back to both the books of Deuteronomy and Numbers, we read about those dimensions kind of being defined for us in the time of Moses. Specifically, those territories are defined by the borders with Ammon and Moab, which the Israelites were told in those passages, and again, you can go back and look them up. The Israelites were told in both of those passages that they were not commanded to wipe out the Ammonites and the Moabites. Now, they did sometimes fight against them, but they were told not to wipe those people out like they were with the people of Canaan. And what was the primary reason why the Ammonites and the Moabites were not completely wiped out? Yes. Yeah, the Ammonites and the Moabites were related to the Israelites in what way? Remember that Ammon and Moab, the individuals Ammon and Moab, were the sons of Lot. And again, we can go back to the book of Genesis to read about their origin. And obviously, their origin did not come in, appropriate means. You go back and read that later. The point was that the Ammonites and the Moabites were partially kin, at least, through Lot and Abraham. They had some relation to the Israelites. They were not commanded to be wiped out. And that's why the Israelites never attempt to push further to the east. Never do they attempt to push at least at this point, further to the south, because they were not commanded to wipe them out as they were the Canaanites. And that essentially explains why those people still exist, at least throughout the rest of the Old Testament. The Israelites were not supposed to take them out as they did the people of Canaan. But we have our northern and our southernmost boundaries now defined for us east of the Jordan River. And in verses 2 and verse 4, we read about two important individuals in the Old Testament. And those are the kings Sihon and Og. And we're going to go back and read about them because it's important to kind of understand why these two individuals specifically are mentioned in this section. But Sihon and Og were two very powerful kings that in the book of Numbers refused to let the Israelites pass on their way to the land of Canaan. And we want to go back in our Bibles here and look at Numbers 21 to remind ourselves about who these kings are and why they are mentioned here specifically. Especially with Og and the concept of Bashan, that becomes important later. So we want to go back in our Bibles now to Numbers 21 and remind ourselves of the Israelites and what happened between these two kings. So Numbers 21, beginning in verse 21, the Bible records that Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, "Let me pass through your land. We will not turn aside into fields or vineyards. We will not drink water from wells. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your territory." But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. So Sihon gathered all his people together and went out against Israel in the wilderness. And he came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Then Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as the people of Ammon, for the border of the people of Ammon was fortified. So again, and we'll come back to this, but as it was just given to us, they come to acquire through the conquest of Sihon, basically the tribe of Reuben and the tribe of Gad later on in time. All right. Verse 25, Israel took all these cities. Israel dwelt in all the cities of the Amorites in Heshbon and in all its villages. For Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and taken all his land from his hand as far as the Arnon. Therefore, those who speak in Proverbs say, "Come to Heshbon, let it be built. Let the city of Sihon be repaired. For fire went out from Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It consumed Ar of Moab, the lords of the heights of the Arnon. Woe to you, Moab! You have perished, O people of Chemosh. He has given his sons as fugitives and his daughters into captivity to Sihon, king of the Amorites. But we have shot at them. Heshbon has perished as far as Dibon. Then we laid waste as far as Napha, which reaches to Medeba. Thus Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites. Then Moses went to spy out Jazer, and they took its villages and drove the Amorites who were there." So Sihon, who ruled in Heshbon, did not allow the Israelites to fight. Under Moses, they defeat Sihon. Again, they acquire eventually the territories of Reuben and Gad. And then in verse 33, we read about the king of Og. It says that they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, or by the way to Bashan. So Og, king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand with all his people and his land, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon." So they defeated him, his sons, and all his people, until there was no survivor left him, and they took possession of his land. Now, I'd have you note here that in verses 33 and through 35, we notice that Moses is given this command, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand." And the reason why is because Og, and specifically the territory known as Bashan, was known for its strength. And eventually the Israelites would use the concept of Bashan as a metaphor to represent strength. The reason why I wanted to focus on that is because one of the scripture readings that we use for the Lord's Supper makes a reference to Bashan, and that's found in Psalm chapter 22. And what that reference in Psalm chapter 22 is trying to indicate to us the concept of strength. And so let's look at that for a moment, since we do sometimes read it during our worship service to kind of explain what that reference is for. Psalm 22 is one of the more familiar psalms in the Old Testament. A lot of it coming from verse 1, where the psalm itself begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which becomes a statement that is later said by Jesus on the cross. And so Psalm 22 itself is tied pretty heavily into the crucifixion of Jesus. It's the reason why we read that. It's the reason why we read that before the Lord's Supper. And specifically, the part that we read begins in verse 22, or begins in verse 12, rather. And we're going to read down to verse 18. Psalm 22, beginning in verse 12, "Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." We know that the events that are being described there are in reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. A lot of it being the animosity of the crowd that was gathered around him. Certainly the soldiers who decided to take Jesus' garments and divide it up, as it says there, determining who got what based on casting lots. But in verse 12, that section again opens up with this reference to the idea, to the territory of Bashan. "Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me." And that reference goes back to Numbers 21, because the Israelites associated the king of Og and the territory of Bashan as being one of the most powerful enemies that they had to face. Supposedly, the cattle of Bashan were thought to be of a much better quality, of a much stronger quality than cattle in the other region, but that also applied to the actual people of Bashan as well. And so that's why in that reference, strong bulls of Bashan, someone who is familiar with the Old Testament would have understood that that passage is not just indicating a strong animosity against Christ, but an exceptionally strong animosity among the crowd that gathered and insulted Jesus and things like that. Anyways, I thought that was important to point out since we use that as our scripture reading. But verse 12 is trying to indicate a level of strength in the form of animosity with Christ that was far different than what anybody else would face, is the point. That's because the Israelites in Numbers 21 came to associate Og in the area of Bashan as a very strong and formidable opponent. But see, all of that is going back to that key point we said, whereas the Israelites felt that Bashan itself was a very formidable enemy, as verses 33 through 35 indicate, the Israelites were able to defeat them, right? Again, Bashan becomes the eastern part of the tribe of Manasseh. just as we think about on the cross, we know, of course, that Jesus faced temptation at various points in his life. But again, sometimes we forget that when it came to the crucifixion, Jesus faced temptation in the Garden of Gethsemane when he had the human element of not wanting to follow through or let this cup pass away from me, right? He faced the human element of not wanting to die on the cross for man's sins. But because of the help of God, he overcame that obstacle, right? The human desire to not want to die through God's help. As he said, not my will, but thy will be done. Through God's help, he overcame that obstacle. And that's the point for us. Jesus overcame the knowledge that he was about to die. He overcame that obstacle because he knew he had God's help. And that's the reminder for us. There is no obstacle that we face that is too big for God. That doesn't mean that we will always be successful in our earthly life. Obviously, Christ did have to die on the cross. But from a spiritual perspective, there is no obstacle that is too big for God, no matter what happens to us physically. That's a key point to keep in mind based on what we have with Sihon and Og. At the immediate moment, though, this is how 2.5 tribes again obtained their land. By that point, Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, and really Manasseh's border probably should be further up here, at least by this point. That's how they come to acquire their. Now, we're not going to say a whole lot about verses 7 through 24. Again, that is in a lot of ways a recap of what we have looked at in chapter 11. So when it comes to the totality of Israel, we'll just simply say this. By the end of verse 24, we see the fulfillment of God's promise all the way back in Genesis chapter 12. That God would give to Abraham and his people a land in which they would live. Essentially, by the end of the chapter, that promise is being completely fulfilled once we define all of these areas that Israel now occupies. In essence, the land has been conquered. Now, chapter 13 will tell us about some parts that were not conquered, specifically Philistia. But in essence, God's promise has come to full fruition is the point. Because now we'll be able to talk about how the tribes are then divided up and how that process will work. And that's where we'll talk about why each tribe becomes important to Israel moving forward. But again, we're not going to read it, but you can look for yourself. Again, you see a lot of cities, a lot of locations named. And really, that's the whole purpose of why they're there. Again, to remind us that the entirety has now been conquered, so to speak. And here's the thing about it. This goes back to our second key point. We know, of course, Moses was not allowed to see the promised land. Or at least he was never able to step into the promised land. He was allowed to see it. We know that there are a lot of Israelites who essentially traveled to get to the land of Canaan. They did not get to see it. But the overall point is that their work in verses 1 through 6 explain why you have verses 7 through 24. We don't have a book of Joshua up to this point. Again, if it had not been for Moses and the Israelites looking at Sihon and Og and proceeding to go defeat them and set the stage for Joshua and his men to cross the Jordan River. Moses and those Israelites never got to fully see the results of their efforts. Yet, their efforts were obviously extremely important for the purposes of God. That's a good reminder for us that as Christians, and maybe this is more so true as you get older, that sometimes you feel like your efforts as a Christian are not making that much of a difference in the world. And sometimes we feel that way because of what we physically see, whether that is dealing with family members who don't necessarily have anything for religion. No matter how hard we try to work with them, they don't see any need to be faithful or to change their lives, to do the right thing and be obedient to God. And we may spend all of our lives working on those individuals, and that can be disheartening when we don't see those results. But we never know later on in life, even after we die, that the efforts that we make while we are on the earth eventually do pay off. And that some people will look back at a family member that passed away and their example and say, you know what, they lived a good Christian life, and I need to follow in that same path. Point is, sometimes we don't always see the efforts, the positive effects of the efforts that we make, even if we work our entire lives. Sometimes those efforts don't come to pass until after we pass away. I know from Dad's perspective, I can say this for myself. This is one of the reasons why at funerals, a lot of times preachers want to talk about the Bible, right, and how to live for Christ, because that provides an excellent point when you have a faithful Christian that dies to look at their life and how they were prepared for eternity. And then for those who are not living righteously, to use their example to show when you die, you want to be in a position where you are comfortable, you know where your eternal home in heaven is. As preachers, that's why sometimes we like to, in essence, kind of preach sermons at a funeral in that way, to get people to think about the examples that someone who has died has left for us. With that being said, are there any comments or questions about what we've said in chapter 12?
Sort of like influence, we're going to die, but our influence doesn't die. The woman that anointed Jesus' feet,
right?
What she did was memorial. She's been dead a long time, but every time we read about that, we're influenced by her. The same is true of us.
Right.
Like Moses and his efforts and so forth, that we lived on after him.
Right. Absolutely. Again, we do look to the Bible as people that have died for inspiration to do the right thing. Again, thank you for your time and your attention this morning. We'll start in chapter 13 next week and begin to talk about the division of the tribes.